Welcome to the program. My guest is an award-winning journalist and author. He also happens to be a Vietnam War resister. Jack Todd, when we return, as Opening Phrase starts now. I'm with Jack Todd, who's been a journalist with the Montreal Gazette for over 25 years. He has also written a memoir dealing with his resistance to the Vietnam War and is soon to release his fourth installment of his historical fiction series, which started with the novel Sun Going Down. Jack, welcome.
Thank you.
Ken Burns is due to release a documentary on Vietnam in 2016?
2016, yeah.
You were part of that process. What was that like?
It was intense. I've never before had to talk about myself for 3 hours, for one thing. And you know, the way they do their interviews, you don't actually, if you're watching, you don't even know there's anyone else in the room. But, you know, this stuff for me, once you get into certain parts of it, is still pretty heavy to this day. And I found myself getting a little choked up. But the really interesting part of it was that because I did it, the historical advisor on that film is a colonel at West Point who teaches history there. And shortly after I shot the segment for Ken Burns, I got a call from him at West Point inviting me down to speak to his cadets at West Point.
Oh my
about
God,
why
what
I
was
deserted
that
from
like?
the Army. My first reaction was no way,
Right.
you know. And after I got there, I found out that he'd been kidding around with the cadets about, you know, when he gets here, we'll throw him in handcuffs and stick him in a broom closet and freak him out. You know, I was very nervous, but they were great. It went well.
Now, dealing with that, and it took you a long time to finally sit down and write the memoir, which is Taste of Metal, which is dealing with your resistance to the Vietnam War. How difficult was it actually to put pen to paper and relive all these experiences that you went through?
You know, I think possibly because it did take me a long time. Once I actually got going with it, it was much easier than I would have thought. I had made 4 or 5 attempts to write a fictionalized version of this. And what would typically happen was I would get up to about 30 pages and read it over and say, this is all crap, rip it up and forget about it for another 5 years, you know. And what actually happened was I went to talk to an agent in Toronto because Philippe Alou wanted me to write his biography.
Oh, wow.
And which was a project I really wanted to do, but I won't go into the ins and outs of the book business, but it just would not have worked. And she said, well, do you have anything else? And I said, well, I've been toying for years of the idea of writing a memoir about leaving the U.S. during Vietnam. And she said, you write it, I'll sell it. And that's basically how it came to be. It was a very...
fortuitous situation.
You know, I went into a meeting intending to write Felipe's bio, which I would still love to do someday, and came out of it writing my own.
Now, your reasons for walking away from the war had nothing to do with the fact that you weren't willing to fight for your country.
No, I think that's the hard part to explain. You know, I still get it. Every time I say something people don't agree with when I'm writing about the Habs, I'll get, you know, coward, chicken, etc. You know, in fact, in 1966, I think it was, I enlisted in Marine Corps officer training at a time when the Marines had the highest casualty rate in Vietnam, the Marine Corps officers specifically. So it certainly wasn't fear. I washed out of that because I had knee problems from basketball, and that same fall, I was an editor on the student newspaper in Nebraska, and I had a friend named Mick Lowe who actually came to Canada too as a draft dodger later and lives up in Sudbury now. And Mick was radical well before I was, and he'd been working on me for a couple of years, and I still remember the conversation. We sat in the car after we both worked on the student newspaper. We had put it to bed for the night. We sat there and talked till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and by the time that conversation finished, I was a committed anti-war activist.
Well, and I think one of the biggest points that your adversaries sort of miss is that chances were you were not going to see
Combat.
Yeah,
no, not in. Once what happened was after I'd washed out of the Marines, then I was drafted 2 years later into the Army. But because I had a university degree and I had been working first at the Detroit Free Press, then the Miami Herald, I was assigned to. I didn't know for sure what the number was, but I think it was journalism. I definitely did not get the infantry designation or any of the things that meant combat in Vietnam. Basically, I would have either worked for Stars and Stripes or I would have written press releases for some colonel in Saigon.
So you basically gave everything up
Yeah.
for a symbolic gesture,
Yeah.
not to save your skin.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's not the way I looked at it. I'm not saying I'm particularly brave. I'm just saying that the possibility of combat didn't really enter into my thinking at that
Right.
point. Even if I hadn't had that designation, anybody who knows the Vietnam War and the way it was fought was that the U.S. at any given time would have 500,000 men in country and maybe 50,000 actually doing the fighting. The rest were all support troops running the PX, passing out beer and things like that.
Passing out beer. Speaking of passing out beer, how do you see the United States, or let me ask this, what would you score the United States on their foreign policy since Vietnam? It seems same mistakes seem to be happening.
Yeah.
Policy change comes back to center. What's your take on that?
It's an endless failure to learn. And a great book of history, she wrote many great books of history, but there's Barbara Tuchman called The March of Folly. And she goes all the way back to the Greeks and the Trojan horse. But what she eventually is leading up to is these colossal mistakes that great powers make through history up to Vietnam. And Vietnam was just in every way, and the most charitable view you can take of it is that it was a huge mistake. It damaged the American economy, damaged faith in government, it undermined the state in every possible way. And really, if you understand that conflict, there was no chance of winning. The only way you could have won, and this was floated about a lot at the time, was to basically nuke the place and leave. Right. Just leave a charred ruin behind. That we've got to destroy the village in order to save it thing, except they would have destroyed the whole country.
Do you think the Americans maybe have miscalculated once again in the Middle East with the pullout from Iraq?
Yeah, Iraq to me, in a way, was a bigger mistake than Vietnam. Yeah. Vietnam, around the time that I was speaking in West Point, I was reading a long history of Vietnam, which was more a political history than a military history. I've read a lot about the conflict, but it was usually on the military side. And this was more the policymakers in Washington and what was going on with the leadership in Vietnam itself, which was just corrupt, horrendous, ruthless, a succession of horrible people. But at every turn, going back to the 1950s, there were dissidents within the State Department, within the White House. It wasn't that they didn't have a voice. They did have a voice. People like George Ball were telling LBJ, they were telling Eisenhower, they were telling Kennedy. And they were just always kind of outflanked by the hawks in the State Department and Defense. People like Robert McNamara, who 30 years after the fact confessed that he had been completely wrong.
What runs through your mind now when you go back to the United States?
It's always difficult. First, the border is difficult, so I get tense about that because, they always give me a little bit of a hard time.
But you're a Canadian.
Yeah, I'm a Canadian citizen now, but as part of this whole thing, 3 years after I came to Canada, I had given up my American citizenship when it looked as though Nixon was going to ride out Watergate, and I just felt like my country was something I didn't recognize anymore.
All right. We're going to take a break, and we will return with Jack Todd. Stay with us. And we're back with Jack Todd. Jack, you arrived in Canada 1969.
So, yeah, January 4th, 1970, right after the...
Describe Hastings Street in Vancouver.
Oh, boy. Oh boy.
Now, this is where you first arrived.
Yeah.
You just deserted. You've come to a new country.
Yeah. I was driven up by a friend of mine who had thought of deserting before himself and had stayed less than a month living on Hastings Street. So he knew where it was. He took me to this hotel, and then he left, and I was almost in shock. I mean, it was really the heart of the Skid Row in Vancouver. Junkies, drunks, you know it can't be too great when I was paying $15 a week for a room. And when I first gave them my American 20 and they gave me back all this colored money, I thought I was getting Monopoly money. I thought, I had done so little research into Canada, I didn't even know you had different currency up here.
And how long did you last? Because you went, came back.
Well, I stayed actually on Hastings Street. What happened was I had no difficulty getting a job. I got hired right away by the Vancouver Sun, but I had to wait a certain period for my immigration to come through and all that. I came up on January 4th. I think it was around mid-February where I finally got my papers. Went to work at the Sun, worked 1 week, and they went out on strike. And the strike lasted, I think, until just about the end of May, and I had actually moved into an apartment, stayed there for about 3 weeks, and I realized that with a strike, I just couldn't afford it. Went back to Hastings Street a second time. And the second time when I went back, then I got a job running the elevator nights and, trying to get some of these guys poured into their rooms when they came staggering in at 3 a.m. It was an experience.
Now, was it also a time where your lifestyle wasn't exactly as it is today?
I just remember hunger, for one thing. I mean, I was missing a lot of meals, which I'm definitely not missing enough of today. And hunger, and just, it was sort of hard to imagine a time when I would be out of this, when you're living like this. I had one or two friends, people that I knew.
Did you ever think you'd get out? Was there ever a time when you thought, oh my God,
Yeah, for sure I had my doubts because, we didn't know that strike could have gone on 2 years. And I really had no other job. I started doing a little bit of freelance for the Georgia Strait, but that was keeping me in about one breakfast a week. And it was a really rough time, and trying to avoid sliding into another lifestyle. And it was just the thing was that it was the toll on the psyche. Like at the end of October, I had a beautiful Cuban-American girlfriend. I was working for the Miami Herald, which was my dream job at like age 22 or something. And, in less than 2 months' time, here I am on Skid Row with a shaved head, no money, no prospects. It's a bit of a shock.
all for your principles.
Yeah, basically, and I certainly thought many times of going back. I did think at the time, which is not what would have happened, but I did think that I was probably facing 5 years in Leavenworth prison if I went back. But I even thought of going back to do that just so that maybe when I came out, I could, live in the U.S. But eventually things settled down.
You eventually came to Montreal. You left. You came back. Finally, you did settle down in Montreal.
Yeah.
Of all places, why?
You're telling me of all places, especially when you're coming from Miami.
And speaking of different, there's the weather aspect. There's also the language aspect.
Everything. And actually, my first stop in Quebec was in Trois-Rivières with a group of students who were attending the university there, and my girlfriend that I met in Vancouver. And other than my girlfriend and one of her friends, I think nobody I was around spoke English. I finally took a job washing dishes in a little cafe, and it was there I saw a Montreal Star on the counter, and I saw a job for writers here, and I came into Montreal in January of '71 to start writing for what was called the Globe Communications Corporation at the time, which was the old midnight tabloid, which I think is now the Globe supermarket tabloid. Right. Not the good Globe in Toronto, the bad Globe. But we were a fun crew.
The one that we see sheep with 3 heads and that sort of thing. At that time, the separatist movement was really blossoming, in not some very nice ways. What was your take on this?
My sympathy at first, I think I saw it more as a social movement and a leftist kind of movement. And I had a lot of sympathy with them. I had a lot of anger toward the U.S. and toward what we called the establishment in those days. I was probably sympathetic up to past I actually voted, I think, for the Parti Québécois in the election when Lévesque came to power. But I voted no in that referendum, and the reason was I began to see it more as an anti-Anglo movement than as a positive social movement. But yeah, for sure, it was because I was a leftist. Leftists at that time were sympathetic to that movement.
Now, you spent 4 years on the city desk at the Montreal Gazette.
Yeah.
You've seen your share of stories of corruption and everything else. This city seems to have been on a better path, let's say, since the last election. How do you see the changes in the city?
Well, I'm actually really intrigued by this city. I've been thinking about writing a series of pieces on it again, sort of picking up where I left off in, I think it was '93 when I stopped writing the city column. I'm more hopeful for Montreal than I have been for a long time. I think we've got a really good mayor.
Right.
Very pragmatic, down-to-earth, popular man of the people. I don't know how visionary he is, but right now I can live without the vision thing, as they used to call it for a while, just to have competent government.
And honesty is...
And honesty. I think he's an honest man. And he's funny.
Yeah.
Let's face it.
Extremely personable.
Yeah, personable.
He's very down to earth.
And I think we need this. And I was taking a long walk here this week on St. Catherine Street, though, and I'm really surprised at how much St. Catherine's gone downhill, like in the last 5 or 10 years. When I was writing city columns back in, I guess, 89, 90, 91, at the time of what I called the Mulrooney recession, I used to say that the biggest store chain on St. Catherine Street was the Allure chain, because every other building was for rent. And, then there was a long period when St. Catherine seemed pretty stable and prosperous, except maybe for the lower end toward the old Forum. But now it seems to be slipping a lot. There are a lot of gaps there. We have these to me, just these horrid travesties that we shouldn't be building in the 21st century, like the Distrant, which seem to be...
They sit half empty.
And they suck so much out of the downtown core. And I understand if you want to come downtown, you're dealing with traffic, you're dealing with parking issues, and it seems to be hurting this core of the city, which is, when I was traveling a lot with the sports teams, you see a lot of cities like Atlanta, Calgary, Houston, places like that, which almost have no downtown core. They're lively from 9 to 5 weekdays, and then they turn into ghost towns. That's never been true of Montreal, and I hope it doesn't become true now.
We're just going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be back with Jack Todd. Welcome back as we continue with Jack Todd. Jack, I'm trying to describe your book series. You know what? I'll just leave it for you to do. But I'll tell you one thing. The first book, Sun Going Down, was a fantastic read. It was something that I literally was just page after page. But how would you describe it?
Well, it's a historical novel based on my family, based on some memoirs. The overall outline of the story is true. It's basically what happened on my mother's side of the family. My great-great-grandfather left the Mississippi River, went to South Dakota. His son became a huge rancher, very successful man. My grandmother got pregnant when she was 16 by one of his bronc riders, and he booted her off the ranch. And then she found out she had tuberculosis. This is around, when she got pregnant would have been around 1909. And shortly before World War I, she found out that she had TB and spent much of the rest of her life in the TB hospital in Denver. So it was kind of an emotional thing. It was a lot. It was a tribute to my mother, who was very courageous, who'd kind of raised her 2 younger brothers and things. And it was also a tribute to the United States. It's a very American novel. It's a 100-year slice of American history from about 1849 to 1949. In the 3 novels, the other 2, Come Again No More and Rain Falls Like Mercy. Now I've written a sequel called The Americans, which is in its 5th revision, and I've got a short novel going called Rose and Poe. So I've actually written 5 novels now, and I don't know for sure which one is coming out next.
Would you ever consider writing a futuristic book based on this idea? Because, I mean, at a certain point, you're going to get to
Yeah, the present,
time.
and then try to look where the future's going. The future scares me so bad, I probably wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole.
Very good. Well, listen, thank you very much for joining us today. It was great having you. And thank you for watching. I'm Sterling Agris, and on behalf of Opening Phrase, have a good evening.